Welcome, audience members. We're just going to take a couple more seconds to make sure everybody can get into the Zoom. Thank you all for joining us. Let's see, a couple more people joining. And if anyone hears any bells in the background, that is my dog chewing my couch pillows. Okay, I think we are at a critical mass, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Welcome everyone to this last panel of the California Law Review's 2020 Symposium, Democracy Reform for the 21st Century. My name is Casey Reed, and I am the Law Review's Symposium editor, and I'm a third-year law student at Berkeley Law, and my pronouns are she, hers. The theme of this last panel is our third guiding principle for the symposium, and that's every voter should have confidence that their vote matters. Since this is our last panel, I'm just going to take a second to say thank you to all of the incredible panelists and facilitators who've joined us over the last 2 weeks, and to all the audience members who've tuned in. We've had some really incredible and real conversations about deeply entrenched problems in this country, about inequality, about racism and corruption, but we've also talked about solutions and change. And I hope you have come away from the symposium feeling a little bit more energized and hopeful, or at least a bit more informed about the issues we face and the solutions we have as we head into election season. So just a quick reminder about the Q&A. You can post a question in Zoom's Q&A module at any time during the panel, and we encourage you to do so. If you leave your name, I'm going to ping you and ask you if you'd join us either on video or audio so we can see your face. But you can also leave your question anonymous and we'll ask it on your behalf. And we're going to start the Q&A around 12:40, so please get your amazing questions in around then. And with that, I will hand it over to our editor-in-chief, Sam Lim. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Lim, and my pronouns are he, him. I want to echo Casey in thanking all of our panelists from over the past week, plus for engaging in such a meaningful and solutions-oriented dialogue about reforming and re-envisioning our democracy. We also want to thank you, all of our attendees, for coming to these sessions, and we invite you to watch, rewatch, or share any of the session recordings linked to the symposium page on our website and on the California Law Review YouTube channel. Finally, let me just take a quick moment to express my deepest thanks to Casey for her spectacular leadership in navigating this rescheduling of this symposium in light of COVID. And I also want to say thank you again to our symposium committee members, the Berkeley Law Event Services team, and our incredible symposium partner, Jeff Bleich, whose vision really brought us all together for this timely and important conversation. With that, let me turn to introducing our moderator, who will be leading today's conversation. He's someone I think of when I hear the phrase, not all superheroes wear capes. I, for one, feel very fortunate to attend Berkeley Law under his leadership, and am grateful for his tremendous support of the Law Review. Dean Erwin Chemerinsky is the 13th Dean of Berkeley Law. He joined in 2017 as Dean and the Jesse H. Chopra Distinguished Professor of Law. Prior to assuming this position from 2008 to 2017, he was a founding Dean and Distinguished Professor of Law and Raymond Prick Professor of First Amendment Law at University of California, Irvine School of Law, with a joint appointment in political science.
Could I interrupt there?
Yes.
You don't need to read my whole bio, and I'm not going to read everybody else's bio. Thank you. Thank you for asking me. Thank you for your kind words. I want to thank the California Law Review for putting on this terrific symposium. I especially want to thank Casey Reed. Putting on a symposium is always a massive undertaking, but to plan it and then have it postponed and then replan it all over Zoom was really extraordinary. And Sam and Casey and everyone on the Law Review, you've just really done a terrific job. It's a wonderful symposium on a topic of urgent importance. And I'm honored to be able to moderate this last panel. There are 3 terrific speakers. And one of the reasons that I rudely interrupted Sam is I'm going to do very short bios of them. I know you have in materials longer bios. I could spend the full hour just telling you about all of their accomplishments. So with apologies to them, I'll do real quick introductions, and I'll do them in the order in which they're going to speak. The first speaker is Professor Larry Lessig. He's the Roy Furman Professor at Harvard Law School. He previously taught at the University of Chicago and Stanford Law School. He's truly an expert in the law of democracy. In fact, he argued in the Supreme Court in May one of the cases that involves the so-called faithless elector in the Electoral College. And Ravel is an attorney. I think it's important to point out she's a graduate of UC Berkeley, as well as Hastings Law School. She chaired the California Fair Political Practice Commission. She was a member and chair of the Federal Election Commission. She served on that commission from 2013 to 2019. And if the internet is to be believed, you're running for California State Senate. Is that right? Yes. I thought that's something important to mention.
Yeah, yes.
And last, Jeff Bleich will be speaking. As was pointed out, Jeff played an instrumental role in the planning and organization of this symposium. So grateful to you for that. He's the chair of PG&E. He's the chair of the J. William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board. He served as the ambassador to Australia from 2009 to 2013. But, and I have to mention this, he's a graduate of UC Berkeley Law School. And I'm tempted to tell you about all the prizes he won at UC Berkeley Law School, his great clerkships and the like, but I think I'll turn it over to Professor Lessig to begin the remarks.
Thank you, Dean Chemerinsky. And I have the list of Jeff's awards, which I'm going to start by reading right now. So actually, Jeff and I co-clerked, so we're close friends for many years. You know, there are any number of movies where there's a scene where the protagonist comes up to a chasm and looks down into this terrifying chasm and is petrified by the thought of what will happen when he inevitably falls into the chasm. And the theme of the movie is always, you got to look beyond the chasm, you got to look over, and you got to see what's coming, what's possible. And the only strength, the only way you're going to master what you're facing is to look beyond. And I kind of feel like we're there in this story of American democracy. It is incredibly easy to look at the catastrophe that stands just before us. I think any number of people, both on the right and the left, recognize if this election spins out of control, if we have no confidence in the ultimate results, if the results seem like they have been fudged or there's cheating, and if we don't feel like we have a president who represents the majority, I fear deeply what will happen in light of that consequence. But I also think that if we can just look beyond this catastrophe, there is enormous reason to be optimistic about the law of democracy and what we can look forward to. And the reason for that is a woman called Nancy Pelosi, who in 2018 made a promise. And her promise was that if the Democrats took control of the House, she would pass the most important democracy reform bill passed since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And when the Democrats did take the House, she took that bill up, H.R. 1, and passed it in the first 7 months of that term, doing what nobody thought would be possible, getting every single Democrat to pass and support fundamental reform for our congressional and federal elections. And that reform included public funding of congressional campaigns, gerrymandering reform, the promise to restore the Voting Rights Act, and a bunch of other ethics reform that was critical to give us a reason to have faith in our democracy again. And that commitment, H.R. 1, has become the floor in the promise that Joe Biden will be making to America when he tries to become our next president. It's at least H.R. 1 that is the commitment of that administration in the year after they become president. And the idea that we're actually contemplating that a year from now, we might have public funding of congressional campaigns or fundamental gerrymandering reform or the restoration of the Voting Rights Act is truly astonishing. I don't think anybody 5 years ago would have imagined that we would be here. And the critical thing for us now is to grab the optimism that that should give us and to assure that we can bring that happy story to ground. And I think that the critical way we need to do that is to recognize something fundamental about how that reform will be brought about. You know, there's any number of people now writing about democracy reform. as somebody who writes books in this field, I'm very angry at all the competitors who are now out there writing books that are trying to talk about the democracy, as if we need another book. I mean, you've got mine, right? So, but the point is, many of these approaches have a list of the top 50 things that have to happen to give us another democracy again. They approach democracy, the reform, the way rich San Franciscans approach renovating or gut rehabbing an old house, right? They have a list of everything that they're going to do. And of course, they can afford to do everything. So they talk about everything they're going to do, and they bring it all out as if this is what has to happen. But the thing about an old house is that it is not going to conspire against your reform. The thing about an old house is that it doesn't have all the money in the world resisting your reform. And I think the critical thing we need to recognize about reform is that we have to be strategic about the reform. And the first change, maybe I think the most important change, standing right next to assuring the voting rights of Americans, especially African Americans who have been denied because of the actions of the Supreme Court. The first change has got to be to change the way we fund campaigns. Because if we do not have a Congress that is free to think about what makes sense to most Americans, as opposed to what their funders care about, we will not have a Congress that can begin to address any of the other important issues in a sensible way. And so the thing we ought to be talking about in this next administration is not the 50,000 great ideas that everybody has, but the commitment to make sure that in that HR 1, or let's call it POTUS 1, the things that Joe Biden pushes when Joe Biden insists on reform, is a firm commitment to a fundamental change in the way we fund campaigns. Now, HR 1 has two ideas built inside it. One is the matching fund system, which New York uses to fund their campaigns, where small contributions get matched up to 6 to 1, so that $100 can be worth $700 in the matching formula. And I think that's a fantastic idea. But one thing that raises concern is when you recognize the argument that will be made against it. And there are many people, many fine people who we love for other reasons, like Ezra Klein, who's not in Berkeley, just over in Oakland, who insists that small dollar funding actually increases polarization. That if you look at the people who give small dollar contributions, they are more extreme than the norm. And that maybe small dollar funding will actually create a more polarized America. And when I think of how I would run the strategy to defeat public funding, if I wanted to defeat public funding, this is what I would do. I would grab Ezra Klein's argument and I would say the last thing America needs is an even more polarized American public. And while I don't think that argument is correct, I think there's lots of great empirical work to show why it isn't correct. I think the greatest opportunity to resist it comes from the other part of HR 1's public funding proposal. HR 1 also includes an experiment, a test, for something called vouchers or democracy dollars. And the idea of vouchers is that you basically give to every voter a sum of money. Their experiment is $25. In the last presidential Democratic primary, Andrew Yang proposed $100. Kirsten Gillibrand proposed $200 per federal election. So in some elections, you'd have $600. And then finally, Bernie Sanders came out firmly for the idea of vouchers as a part of fundamental reform. And the reason Bernie Sanders supported it was that he said, the only way to make sure that we have the vast majority of Americans participating in the funding of campaigns is to make it easy and equally obvious for every American to be able to participate in that funding. And if we gave every American vouchers, and I would love Kirsten Gillibrand's solution, but I'll take Andrew Yang, that's perfectly adequate in my view. If everybody had $100 in vouchers, then the polarizing effect would be swamped by the many people in the middle who otherwise would not be in the process of funding campaigns, but who would use these vouchers to help fund campaigns. And we would radically change the economy of influence that exists in Washington right now. Candidates would raise money not by talking to the few who give up $5,400 to their campaigns. They would be talking to the many who would enable them to fund their campaigns in this different way. So if we can see the hope that is across this chasm, and we can organize strategically to get to a place where we will succeed in passing that reform, I hope we will also understand that that reform needs to bolster the opportunity for this broad scale participation in funding of campaigns that would radically change the corruption that now exists in Washington. So I've done that in 9 minutes and 54 seconds.
Wow, that's amazing. So I'm next. Thank you, Dean, for the introduction, and thank you to California Law Review for inviting us to what I think is a really, really significant discussion. And I want to sort of play off a little bit about what Larry said, because I agree with him wholeheartedly about HR 1. HR 1, if those of you watching have not read that, you should, because it is the most comprehensive law that is possible in democracy reform, because it deals with all of the issues that are problematic in our country today and that do, as we've seen, impair equal participation of all citizens in our electoral process. And so for me, if it's fantastic that it passed in the first session of the Congress, and unfortunately, of course, it has been stalled in the Senate and not even taken up at all, or have any of the democracy reforms that have been introduced this year or previous years in Congress, which, you know, leads me to, I love his enthusiasm and I love his hopefulness, and we need to be hopeful, but I have spent too many years in DC at the Federal Election Commission, which is entirely dysfunctional, even though its purpose is for democracy. It's to provide as much transparency and disclosure and make sure that there's fairness in the electoral process. And for years, probably 10, it has not done any of those things. And in fact, if anything, it has been an impediment, because the other day I testified before Congress on the post office and the individual who is the postmaster. And what is very clear is that because there's no action at the FEC, people act with impunity. And the few campaign finance laws that we actually have are not ever followed by people who don't need to, and therefore they just avoid them. And that has a huge implication on our democracy and what we're seeing. In fact, it has a big implication on what I want to talk about, which is another aspect of this, which is what I consider to be voter suppression on the internet, that we all know about, but I want to talk a little bit more about it because it's clear that it's going to occur and has been occurring again in 2020, both in the primary, but as well as in this particular election. And I think it's something that we really have to be concerned about. But let me also make one other point, because I know this is an opening, but I have to respond to you about what you said about from Ezra Klein, because as a candidate, and maybe this is anecdotal, but I will say that I think that there's some truth to that about small donor financing. And believe me, I get money from End Citizens United, as you know, and I get $1 here and $1 there because people believe in my views. But I also know that sometimes that large amount of small donor money that comes is something that sometimes comes because of the extremes, because of the fact that people are, candidates are appealing to those extremes. And that's what makes people excited about giving, as opposed to what we really want in our politics, which is people who are thoughtful, who are concerned about the issues, who look at data, look at what the community needs, what the country needs, and tries to make thoughtful decisions. And so we have to deal in some ways with the way that people respond to political messages. And I think there's nothing that shows that more than what has happened on the internet. And I'm sure everybody has heard, of course, about Russian intervention and now Iranian intervention and Chinese intervention. But of course, that was quite true in the 2016 election, and it is true now. And the whole purpose of that intervention, particularly the Russian intervention, is that it was intended to sow discord, anger, polarization. Internet communications were targeted to particular groups, for example, anti-immigrant groups or pro-gun rights groups, and also targeted to African Americans solely for the purpose of either increasing that discord, increasing that anger, increasing the hatred of government and democracy itself. And also in the particular case of LGBTQ youth, Latinos, as well as African Americans mostly, it was intended as voter suppression. And there was clear voter suppression, whether it be about, hey, you can text your vote, go right ahead, that's no problem, or the date of the vote is, November 12th or something like that. That was obviously clear voter suppression, but there is also an incredible amount of targeting to small groups like, well, in the 2016 election, for example, the Russians had a fake group called Blacktivist on Facebook, which was Russian in origin, and it actually had more viewers, more members of that group on Facebook than Black Lives Matter did. And what they did with that particular Facebook page was to show videos of Hillary doing terrible fake videos. We'll go back to Jeff Bleich's AI soon. Fake videos that showed things that were false, and then said to people, don't bother voting. You shouldn't vote because neither one of these candidates is good. Nobody is good for African Americans. And that's just one example. It was done repeatedly across platforms and with unbelievable misinformation. And we know, for example, that in September and October of 2016, Twitter removed 10,000 automated accounts that were posing as Democrats to convince all those minority groups to not vote, and especially to provoke the anger of African Americans. And there were tons of misinformation that came through Facebook and the like. In fact, the amount of targeting and people who looked at that misinformation and that urge not to vote, or to vote based on to change the vote, to switch the vote, the number of the audience in 2016 for those Twitter and Facebook posts was 126 million Americans. And when you think that the reality was the number of people who actually voted was only 137 million people, that is astounding how many people that those communications were able to reach. And we know that it is the most vitriolic, the most outrageous things that get organically passed on the internet platforms. That's what goes from person to person, because you see, when it's truth, it's not so interesting. But when you see these things, you say, God, did you see this? And people pass it on. And we don't have any ability really to track those things, because the United States has no laws that are applicable to the internet at the moment. While there are disclosure laws required in campaign finance about ads, or about even what are called issue ads in campaign finance, which are some of these ads that subtly reference a candidate or an important issue of legislative importance. Those two, in campaign finance law, if they're close to the election, then they have to disclose who's behind the ads. But none of those things apply to the internet. And that is really, really problematic. There are no laws. The tech companies have made some slight changes, but it's clearly insufficient. And in part, it comes from the mining of data and the use of that data for evil, I would say. And a lot of it also comes from utilizing their algorithms to be able to use that data to target certain individuals. And so the tech companies have a big responsibility on their own. And I know they're saying that they're conscious of these issues, but so far there has not been enough to deal with this problem. And, we know some people say, well, it obviously didn't make any difference in 2016, and there's no way to prove that it made any difference in 2016. But there's actually been a number of studies that showed, for example, there was one of Ohio University where the Democrats who were given misinformation and or absolute lies on Facebook, actually, in a really high percentage, the ones who believed it didn't vote for Hillary, and the ones who didn't believe it only didn't vote for Hillary in a very small percentage. So they clearly have impact. It's clearly true that in the 2016 election, 8% fewer African Americans voted at all than had voted previously, primarily in swing states. And for those of you who haven't read the book by Kathleen Hall Jameson called Cyber War, where she talks about these issues together with other matters having to do with hacking and trolls and the like, she came to the conclusion that beyond a reasonable doubt, and she's a well-known voting rights and voting journalist who's well-respected, she said that without a reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, the election was altered in 2016 because of these things. So these are things I think we can change, we will change. And for the optimism part, I know I'm close to my time here, but I definitely agree with you, Larry, that we have to all be positive that there are changes that can happen, and even changes that can happen in this issue while we have certain constitutional constraints. But it's worrisome what's going to happen in the election coming up, because it's too soon for any change.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Sam. Thank you to CLR and to Sam Linson and Casey Reed and Berkeley event staff, and I'm so honored to be on this panel with my former co-clerk Larry Lessig and our future senator and my colleague and the last administration, Anne and Erwin, who we've done more amicus briefs together, for losing causes. And I think it could be a record. It could be a Guinness Book of World Records. And so thank you for always fighting the great fight with me. I appreciated the description that Larry offered at the beginning of a chasm that we face in the event that the American public no longer trusts in its election system. And then the kind of graphic description that Anne just provided about why people may not have faith in our electoral system. I just want to pick up on the theme that Larry's began with, which is that this chasm that we're seeing, it's not unprecedented. It's appeared before in American history. And that should give us some hope, simply because we have faced it before and we've leapt it before. Whenever there's a radical shift in technology that changes our economy, it's going to create social unrest. And this usually produces uncertainty and fear and capacity for exploitation of that fear and uncertainty, and typically by those who are in a position to consolidate vast power and wealth in relatively few hands. This happened between the 1880s and 1920s in the United States. And just to put it in perspective, because you always think, nothing has ever happened like what's happened with the internet age. In that era, just in 1 year alone, the electric light bulb and the internal combustion engine were both invented. And in about a 3-decade period, you suddenly had cars and airplanes and telephones and motion pictures and appliances and elevators and skyscrapers and suburbs and highways, and the world radically changed under people's feet virtually overnight. And all the things that I described happened. The wealth consolidated, power consolidated, government corruption by wealthy interests, and manifested itself in all sorts of ways, very similar to what we see now, the pooling of wealth in relatively few hands, and the exploitation of data that we're experiencing now is very much like the exploitation of labor during that period. And the political system was paralyzed because it didn't understand the new economy. People weren't talented enough to get out ahead of it. And those who understood the system understood that this is a moment when they could seize power and exploit it. And this is an era of party bosses and corruption and political machines. And if you go back and look at that era, Americans went kind of haywire, and we had anarchists, and we had bombings, and we had a lot of stuff that we don't really remember in American history, including sedition laws. But this is all just 100 years ago in very similar circumstances. And the progressive movement developed during that time in reaction, mostly going around Congress, including constitutional amendments, one that provided for the popular election of senators instead of having these corrupt legislatures put senators in. But probably the most significant, clearly the most significant, one of the most significant in our country's history, was doubling the number of people who could actually vote in elections through the enfranchisement of women. And then there were other manifestations as well. There was a civil service was put in to help address corruption and patronage system, and a whole education system, which made it a right for people to have high school education, and actually a requirement, so that they would have civics education. And you can see a whole number of knock-on effects in terms of fixing bad policies that resulted from a healthy government and from the reforms that those produced. So this can be done, and I'm with Larry. I am optimistic. I once heard George F. Will, who's a pessimist, explain why he was one, because I can never understand why people are pessimists. But it actually made sense. He said, when you're a pessimist, you're either right or you're pleasantly surprised. And so, but I'm an optimist, and I think HR1 is one of those critical first steps. But I think the other major step that we need to think about is why public engagement matters. It's that our government works better when the people actually understand that it's our government, it's our country. Those we elect are our servants, and they are there to accomplish the constitutional norms, to maintain those, and to advance the policy interests of all Americans, not just those who have forms of influence. And so I wanted to talk about how we get to that nirvana, where we start thinking more about ourselves as the leaders of our country, as opposed to victims of leadership. And one thing you look to are lessons of history, but the other one I wanted to suggest is that we look to other nations and what they've done. So I wanted to give one example, and then that will be my principal contribution here. And that is, when I lived in Australia, they have universal voting. In Australia, they treat voting the way we treat jury duty, which is everyone's got to do it, got to show up. You may not actually have to serve on the jury, so you don't actually have to vote for either one of the candidates. You can put in an empty ballot or write in, your own name if you want, but you have to show up. And what's interesting about that is if you actually have to show up and do it, people take it seriously. They have very few of what I just described. It's called donkey voting, because it's a sense that over time there's a cultural norm that develops where everyone is responsible for their vote, and they feel like the government is a reflection of them personally. And by having universal voting, you eliminate a lot of the ills that we've been identifying in our own system. You reduce the single issue candidacies and the slicing and dicing of the demographic, which is focused just on issues that are important to one group or another. It eliminates voter suppression. It takes a lot of money out because you don't have this whole get out the vote effort. Everyone's going to vote anyway. And trying to micro-target doesn't work because what you're really looking for is a whole set of issues that appeal to everyone. So it reduces money in politics as well. Now, if you think about it, it seems like an enormous lift to try and get Americans to believe that we could all, be required to vote. And you think, well, let's not even think about ideas like that. But while we're working on HR1 now, we've got to be thinking more broadly for the future. And this may take a while, but imagine what the suffragettes faced. We're going to double the vote and give the vote to a group of people who have never been assumed to have that right by the men who controlled government and who controlled the foundation of the forming of the country. Must have seemed like a much bigger lift at that time. In the United States, originally voting here, it wasn't secret ballot. You actually had to announce your vote in public in front of other people in your community, and then they would come out and harass you in the, outside and beat you up, which is how we developed the secret ballot. At the time, people thought, "But you can't have a secret ballot? That'll be sinister." Now we can't imagine not having secret ballots. So the path to universal voting, I think, can be achieved, and we can get across that chasm. The big question is going to be how you get there, and it's going to be in a series of steps. So let me just raise one vision for how you get there before we open it up more broadly. I think it probably starts with some individual states adopting it, but first they've got to overcome the complaint that, well, the reason people don't vote is it's so damn hard. You got to wait in line for 4 hours, going to miss work, and so you need to have voting from home. How do you get voting from home in states all over the country in a reliable system that's trustworthy? Well, we already have federal laws that require every person who serves in the military, who serves in the State Department as a diplomat, everyone who is serves in the intelligence community, they have to be able to vote in their home county from wherever they are in the world. In order to make that real for people, federal government would have the authority to pay for proper voting systems in every single county that allows for mail-in ballots. If you have that in place in every county, then it's pretty hard for people to argue that it's too difficult to vote, because every county is equipped with a consistent system that has been approved by the federal government that allows for mail-in voting. And once that infrastructure is there, then you start talking about the benefits of it for people with disabilities and elderly people and others having access to these systems. And in some state, maybe Oregon, for example, where you have ballot initiatives, and they're tired of having people calling them every 20 minutes in the last 3 months before an election to tell them to go out and vote. They say we can have our TVs and our phones and everything back if we just have universal voting. They adopt it, it works there, and before you know it, other states pick it up, and before too long you have less partisan debate, less money spent on advertising, none of the annoying get out the vote harassment, and far less focus on either generating, either suppressing voters or generating certain voters to go out. That'll take years, but in order for us to get there, we need to start planning it now. So that's one example, but my view is that if people are dedicated to it, as Larry has been for decades now, as Ann has been for decades now, as Erwin's been for decades now, we'll get there. We will cross the chasm. The ideas are there, and it's just a matter of working through the logistics, having a clear plan, setting priorities, and then moving on them and not being deterred. So with that, turn back to the Dean.
Thank you. Thanks to each of you for this terrific presentations. I want to get quickly to student questions, but I'm going to ask one question. The topic of this panel was about the importance of voters having confidence in the results of the election. I want to focus on the November 2020 election. Unless either Biden or Trump wins decisively, how can voters have confidence in the outcome of this election? We know there's going to be foreign influence. You've talked about it. We know there's going to be a great deal of false speech. We know there's going to be false foreign provided speech. We've already heard the Republicans led by the president say that there's massive voter fraud and points to the voter suppression that goes on. And then you have the problem with the mails. Any of us who send an absentee ballot can't know it's going to be received in time to be counted. In light of this, isn't there likely to be a lack of confidence in the outcome of this election? And what's going to be the result of that come December, January, February?
So I agree with you. There's lots of reasons why we're going to be skeptical, especially because it's clear that the strategy of the president will be to leverage either the red mirage or the blue shift, which is that on election night, it will seem like he's in a much stronger position than he will seem on the morning after the election. And that kind of makes me wonder why the Democrats have not been more willing to take up Marco Rubio's suggestion of moving the day that the Electoral College votes weeks ahead of, or weeks into January rather than in December. Because it seems the one thing we need right now is the opportunity for orderly process to consider all of the ballots, especially the ballots that will be mailed in. And the one really, I mean, there are many terrible things about the fragile infrastructure we have for electing the president, but one that's really terrible is this incredibly compressed period where we've got to resolve all these questions before the Electoral College actually votes. But apparently the progressive caucuses have now told the Democrats they should not take this idea up. And I frankly have not yet heard the argument why it makes sense to continue putting pressure on our infrastructure when it will have the consequence, Erwin, that you've identified.
I also think it's really problematic because there are gaps in the law. There are not so many clear statements about how, in the law, about how to deal with some of the problems that we're likely to have should the votes be really close and there be discord by either side about what to do and how to deal with the votes. And I think that the laws really need to be changed to be more specific about voting circumstances. But I don't think there's any question about it that what's being promulgated now is to make people have those doubts about what the outcomes are going to be. And what I think the press has a really big responsibility to not communicate the way they normally do on the evening of an election, to make prognostications that turn out to be false or not to actually come to be true. And so they need to step up and say, we're not going to make that determination now because so many ballots are out to be counted. And I think part of that is making people understand what the process is and that it's not fraudulent, that it'll take some time to count. I don't know, and maybe you know this, Larry. I mean, I know that there are certain dates, and of course you've got the date of, the 20th of January, and it's all truncated, and so that may account for some of the concerns that the Democrats have about the Electoral College votes and the ability of altering of those votes. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe you do, but I do think that ultimately what we're going to have to do in this country is to have some more of a national response and laws, instead of voting being totally governed state by state as well.
Yeah, look, I share the concern of the dean that people are not going to be confident about the outcome of this election, no matter who they're supporting. Part of the reason why I was pushing for universal voting is if every vote is made and everyone's counted, people, they may not like the outcome, but they have confidence that it reflects the will of the people. Here's where I think we are and what we need to do. Where I think we are is last night, I try and balance between CNN and Fox News. So I was watching Tucker Carlson interview Steve Bannon. And the whole storyline for Steve Bannon was that Democrats are going to lose the election on election night and then slowly steal it back with fake ballots over the next 13 days. And so he says the election will be on November 3rd, but the war begins on November 16th. And he used the term "the war begins" on November 16th. So they are preparing to win with walk-in ballots and lose with the total ballots, but claim that it wasn't a loss, but an act of fraud and theft. And Democrats first need to, start getting the message out loud and clear that this is not an election day, it's election week, and that the results will not be known for a week. Secondly, so you got to frame expectations first, and secondly, there has to be a clear narrative that is about the security and safety of mail-in ballots. All the things that the dean said are true, but you're talking about on the margins. You're talking about things that would affect less than 1% of the vote, maybe 1.5%. And so if they go different ways, potentially different directions, they tend to balance each other out a bit. And that has happened in almost every election. There have always been some problems of some sort in some states and some counties. So rather than focus on those as indications that this is a failed election, have to assume, and history backs this up, that the result is going to be generally reflective of the public's views, except for, potentially, small amounts there. And we've got to frame that issue as well, that people have to trust the outcome of the election. That's, if we don't believe in it, there's no way we can move forward.
I want to let the students have the remaining time for questions. We have about 10 minutes left. Casey, do you have some questions to pose?
Yes, thank you. This is a question that I think really reflects the theme of the panel, that every voter should have confidence that their vote matters. This person is asking about how we can reconcile the Supreme Court's treatment of the Voting Rights Act and circuit courts, like the recent 11th Circuit decision, which was broken on one of our panels. Just wanted to add that. How do we reconcile that treatment with public perception and confidence in voting?
I'm going to defer to the professor.
Yeah, me too.
Well, I don't think there's a reconciliation. I think they're in contradiction. I think part of the problem with voting jurisprudence is its objective is not to build participation and confidence. And we can argue about the justification for that, but that's the consequence of it. There are many people who feel like they're disqualified unfairly from participating. And I think we need to recognize, though, that more people choose not to vote than are forced not to vote. And the reason they choose not to vote is they don't think there's any reason to vote. And they don't think there's any reason to vote because they think actually the shots are being called by different sorts of people for different sorts of reasons. So we need to both give people a reason to vote, whether we have a law forcing them to vote or not, give them a reason to vote and make it easy. And the Supreme Court's not been helping on either of those two fronts.
Might I add a thought about this? I obviously agree very much with what Larry said. To me, what's very troubling is the pattern of decisions. Right now, the Republican mantra led by Donald Trump is less votes are better. And then you look at what's going on in the lower courts and how much the judges' votes have corresponded to the political party of who appointed them. You mentioned the 11th Circuit case, which I think was a week ago today, where the 11th Circuit said that it's permissible for Florida to deny ex-felons the right to vote unless they pay their fines and fees. It'll keep about 775,000 people from voting. All of the judges in the majority were appointed by Republican presidents. The dissenters were appointed by Democratic presidents. The day before, a week ago yesterday, the Fifth Circuit upheld Texas denying absentee ballots to those under age 65 unless they could show something like a disability or out of the area. It was 2-1 with the two Republican nominees to the Fifth Circuit being in the majority. We even look at the Supreme Court when it dealt with the Wisconsin case or the Alabama case or the Texas case. They were 5-4 with the Republican nominees to the Supreme Court all supporting overturning district court orders that expanded the right to vote. I think one of the things that we need to say and say loudly is we should expect the judges to be enforcing the Constitution and protecting the right to vote, not following the political party ideology that's trying to suppress the vote. And so I find the pattern of all of these cases very disturbing right now.
Thank you. Oh, did you want to jump in?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Nothing to add.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, this question, I think, is for Anne, but if anyone else has ideas, please jump in. What does a functional FEC look like in terms of making sure that voters have confidence in our democratic institutions?
Well, I think the first premise is exactly what Larry has been talking about, which is that the whole purpose of the FEC, not just the disclosure, but the limits and all of those other regulations that they have, is to assure that there's, in my view, others don't interpret it this way, but that people should have an equal voice in our government, that people should be able to participate. And it is quite true that what has happened is that the campaign finance system has truly engendered a lack of trust in the government institutions and in political campaign fairness. And that, I think, and that does result in lower participation. The FEC now has no quorum. And so they're going to do nothing with regard to this election. And it has become so politicized, like the federal bench, that there hasn't even been the ability to appoint anybody. There hasn't been the ability to actually enforce any of the laws that would result in at least some faith that the process is fair. I always recommended, and I think that there are some bills in Congress that are following in my recommendation, which is that there should be a different way of appointing the FEC. The FEC now is supposed to have 6 members, no more than 3 of one political party. And what has happened over the years is that because it takes 4 votes to do anything, there's a deadlock and nothing happens. And in fact, the courts have interpreted those deadlocks in favor of the group, in this case, the Republicans, who don't want anything to happen and don't want any enforcement. And so that needs to change. There needs to be some kind of a blue ribbon commission of people who are nonpartisan, who know about the purposes of the law and believe in the purposes of the law, who are finding commissioners to sit, of whether they be independents or whatever party they are, who are people who are going to abide by the law.
Thank you. And maybe I'll just jump in with I think what will be our last question, and ending on a sort of solutions-oriented question, a hopeful note. Given the economic impacts of COVID on local, state, and federal government, is public campaign financing likely a longer-term ambition? And if so, how do we lay the groundwork now? And what other reforms are more immediately available to restore confidence in the right to vote?
The short version is it's a long-term project unless Democrats win the Senate and the White House. If they do, then public financing happens next year.
And has to happen, because there's nothing else that gets done in a sensible way if we don't end this corruption in the way we fund campaigns. And I think Democrats have been better than Republicans, but no Democrat will tell you they don't feel the constraint of the fundraising system. I mean, ask Jeff, ask Ann, two people who have run real campaigns and had to live in the world where they have to suck up to people with lots of money in order to run their campaigns. If we don't fix this, nothing else is going to happen. So I agree. We've got to send the Dark Lord of DC, Mitch McConnell, back to Kentucky. That's a necessary condition. And we have to win the presidency. And if we do that, I'm incredibly optimistic. And look, my brand is pessimism. So this is really significant. I'm optimistic. We could do this. And a year from now, I can move on to another problem because I've been doing this for a long time now.
Thank you, Professor Lessig, for that.
Let me say finally, I am a pessimist, but I agree with the solutions that have been described. But I just want to also say to people that problem with campaign finance as a person who's running for a state office is no different in a state as it is in the federal government. And so those changes, for those of you who are living in other states, can actually start at the state level and hopefully be something, because that's where things can get done, and can be something that will serve as models and go state by state. And then maybe the federal government will sign on because of that.
Thank you. Well, I know it's 1 o'clock, but I want to ask Dean Chemerinsky as our facilitator if you have any last thoughts before I just say thank you.
Mine is just a thank you. Thank you to Larry and to Ann and Jeff for those wonderful presentations. And again, thanks to you, Casey, for putting on this wonderful symposium, and for everyone at the California Law Review who put it together.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. This concludes the symposium, but the recordings for this panel and all of our panels are on our YouTube channel. So please check that out, and please stay safe and well and strong and hopeful throughout this election season. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye all.